Let's go back to page 49.
What did you say? Oh, no, it's 49, but this is the last one.
That is 48. Oh, go to the next page up. That page. Yeah. So when did we meet last? 2 or 3 weeks ago?
2 weeks.
At some point I told you that I was real fortunate because I wasn't going to have to go to Austin again. Then I had to go to Austin. Actually, I had to go to San Antonio. When we left it, we talked about Paul coming home from his 3rd mission trip, what happened in Jerusalem. He was going through a purification ceremony, period. There was a festival, a religious festival during that time. He didn't do anything wrong, but some of the Jews from Asia had come down, saw him there, and caused a big fuss. He's arrested, then he's taken to Caesarea, and he's there for 2 years. He appeals to Pilate. When he gets here to Sidon, the centurion who's taking all of these prisoners to Rome allows friends to come and, he has time with friends and stuff like that. Anyway, they sail up here around Cyprus to Myra, and at one, I think it's this point here, or maybe it's there, they hook up with a wheat merchant from Egypt. And the wheat merchant is going to make this trip in September because that's the period where storms really kick up in the Adriatic Sea. Okay, so if he can take his wheat and get it to Rome, he'll be paid a premium. So his boat is full of wheat. Rome needs wheat. Rome gets wheat from Egypt. So he's all up about making the trip. The centurion is like, yeah, let's do it. But then Paul announces, might not be a good idea, But anyway, they take off. They run into some rough seas, and again, Paul's saying, let's just stay here. This is a bad idea. Bad things are going to happen if we keep going on this trip. And, I guess they're enticed by the money and so on and so forth. So the owner of the ship goes out there, 14 days of storms, and then Paul takes over the ship. Literally takes over the ship. And that's the extraordinary thing about this journey is he's a prisoner, and by the time you get to here, he's in charge. Because he's telling the people on the boat, just had a vision, we're going to be okay, but right now we haven't been eating. We need to eat. Eat as much as you can. They're all eating. Then he says, we're not going to die. Nobody's going to die. The boat's going to get damaged, but nobody's going to die. So they're going over here towards Malta, or one of the islands around Malta, and they can see that they're coming into shore, and there's some tricks they use to slow a boat down so it doesn't run on a reef and with anchors and whatnot. And they're doing that, and it runs up on a reef anyway, and they had already scuttled a bunch of their cargo and equipment for the boat, and but now the boat's starting to break up, right? And so people could die and stuff, and the Roman guards are thinking, well, first there's an attempt by some of the people that work on the ship to actually leave and let everybody else die. But then there's some talk from the soldiers, we got to kill all these prisoners because if any of them get away, like we learned on some of these other mission trips, we get killed. And Paul comes out again and he says, nah, we're not going to do that. Just so the captain says, all right, if you can swim, swim. If you can't, just grab something and float and go that way. And they do, and they get to Malta. And in Malta, we said that's where they were making a fire to warm themselves because they just came out, and Paul's putting a bundle of wood down, and a viper, a snake, attaches to his hand, attaches. And all the locals are going like, and gets off, and then the locals are going, "You're gonna die," and he doesn't die. So the locals first think, well, he's getting his punishment. He must be a bad guy, and that's just punishment. But then when he doesn't die, they think he's like a god, right? So they stay in Malta for a pretty long period of time, and I guess during that time they fix the boat, and then they sail up to the boot of Italy, and then I guess up to around Pompeii, and then the rest of the way is done on land. And we learn that when he gets there, and they're making the journey on land, that people would come out, and Christians would come out and to meet him. And you go, well, how do they even know about him? Well, 3 years earlier, he had sent, when he was in Asia, he had sent a letter to the Romans, okay? And that's how they knew who he was. And we said the last time that when he gets to Rome, he's under house arrest, he can do what he wants, it's for a period of 2 years. And then Luke stops telling the story. Luke starts the story with the birth of Jesus, with Luke, and then it Acts the resurrected Jesus, and then the apostles and all this, and he gets to that point, and he stops the story. And he wrote that about within 30 years of it happening, or less, he writes his book. He has the best first-hand knowledge of anybody. And that's where I said, we were going to talk about the fire, which we'll do tonight. And I said that there was I guess he would have been like a pope. His name is Clement. Now he lived after Paul, but he wrote fairly soon, I'm talking decades, that Paul went over here to Spain. Because there's going to be a 2-year period where Paul is free to go. There's no record of nothing. Paul says in one of his letters to the Romans, he says, I'm coming to see you, then I'm going to Spain. Okay? There's no record. But if you go to Spain, the Spanish have this big walk. It takes days and days and days and days, and it's all about Paul at the end. They think he went, but there's nothing there. I told you that when we first started, that there's a theory that the Christians started to come into Rome, and the Jews got really upset, and there were riots and stuff. And so, I don't know if it was Claudius, but one of the Caesars, emperors, expelled all the Jews out of Rome. And that's where we found out about Aquila and Priscilla. Found out about them. You want to know something about them you didn't know? I got the greatest compliment in the world. The last time I was here, I got the greatest compliment. Greatest compliment. You want to know what it was? First, it was from Stan. You want to know what he said? He said, I've learned a thing or two, I guess. That's the greatest compliment. For Stan to say that, that's like...
Yeah. Blessings from the Pope.
Yeah. That was good. Aquila and Priscilla were tent makers. So when they meet Paul on the second mission trip, and they meet him in Corinth, they're there because they've been exiled from Rome. And that when he takes them to Ephesus, that's what they did to make a living. They kind of went into business together. I bet he didn't know that, did he? Who's in his class? You can raise your hand. Who's in Stan's class?
Nobody.
Nobody? Seriously?
The
Culpeppers,
Culpeppers,
He just talks to himself.
Really?
John King.
You're in his class?
No.
No?
No.
Joan Brantley.
I was gonna ask you, if you were in his class, I was gonna ask you to spring that question on him. What did Aquila and Priscilla do for a living? Anyway, so he's in Rome. He reaches out to the Jewish community. He wants to make sure it's safe-ish. And they come to meet him and they go, you know, he's afraid they've already got word from Jerusalem that he's a bad guy and all that. And they say, honestly, we haven't heard anything about you. So they start conversations and talking and all that. It goes on for about 2 years. Now, here's a question. I gave somebody here the answer already. Jesus dies here. And let's say he dies in the year 30 AD. Okay? And when we're talking about this taking place, we're probably talking 30 years later. And I think I told you, maybe I didn't. The Catholics believe Peter established the church. Thus he was the first pope. Did I tell you about his grave? Did I tell you about seeing that? When you go into the Vatican, maybe it's St. Peter's, whatever. When you go in there, they got this big monument, right? And we're with a tour guide. And they said, Peter's buried there. Oh, really? Yeah. She goes, they've done some, like, gone under and done research. His grave's here. There's all these people's graves around, and they all point towards this one grave. So they really think he's there. But they believe he's the father of the church. Right?
Yeah. That's the key.
But that church started before he got there. So, let's read.
That's your cue, Sean.
Yeah, that's your cue, Sean. Matter of fact, I'm going to give Sean's to her first. So, the question is this. If Peter gets there decades after the fact, after the death of Christ, how did Christians get here? We don't even know when they got there. Because when all the Jews were expelled, I mean, now you're talking 20 years after the fact. So, if you're ready, you can read.
Okay. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly, a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment, because each one heard in their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and parts of Lydia near Cyrene, visitors from Rome."
Stop. How did Christianity get to Rome? If this is a class, we'd have a bad quiz right now.
Sounds to me like the visitors took it over.
What?
Visitors from Rome.
The visitors from Rome were present at Pentecost. Visitors. So when they went home, they took it with them. So that means to go from Jerusalem to Rome, I mean, in a matter of years after the crucifixion, Christianity could have been in Rome. Okay. So now we figured out how Christianity got there and why he was writing a letter to them 3 years earlier. And then by the time Peter got there, they were already established. As a matter of fact, they were established not just in the city of Rome. How many people lived in the city of Rome when he got there?
Whole bunch.
I got one guess. Whole bunch. Have another guess? Quite a few.
About a million if you look at your numbers.
1 million people lived in Rome. That's a lot today. And so and then one of the historians said about the Christians, he said a flippant thing. He says, like, any old religion from any old province, they all end up here because it's the center. So when he was talking about Christianity, he goes, it had something to do about some guy, and I don't know if he did anything, they killed him, and his people came, and that's how they got there. Okay? So, when we left off last week, now we can go to page 54. Yeah. So, before we even start, tell me about the fire in Rome. Tell me the story behind that. What is the story about the fire in Rome?
Nero burns it down.
Nero burns the city down.
And laid his fiddle while it burned.
Now, everybody who agrees with that, you need to raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. I'll put it different. If you don't believe that's true, raise your hand. So I assume you all believe it's true. Nero burns the city for whatever reason he wants to burn the city. Is that your consensus?
He was crazy to begin with.
He was crazy, okay?
Crazy on that.
He was crazy, and so he burnt the city. Okay. Now, if you go to the bottom of page 54, there's a number of accounts from historians who were there. And we give you the names of these historians. What we know is a fire begins, and it spreads rapidly, and there's looting and arsonists, and they make it worse, and so on and so forth. The fire burns for 6 days and 7 nights before they got it under control, and then it reignited and burned for another 3 days. So the big fire. Rome was divided into districts. 10 of the 14 districts were ruined. In other words, 2/3 of that city was ruined from that fire. Now, it says that history blames Nero for the fire, but there are different accounts. So, Sean, if you'll read where it says G and then the letter I, would you read that?
Okay. Nero blamed the fire on the sect of believers who lived in the poorer sections of the city. Written by Tacitus, the Annals passage 15.44 follows a description of the fire, and the key part of the passage says, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and the most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, first the source of evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. According Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of the hatred against mankind.
Now, the three historians that I said wrote about the history, one of them says that Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire started, and that he ran back, got back as soon as he can to supervise the fire. There's really nothing to say that he started the fire or he did it just for, there's a note in here that he did it, he burned it so he could, to bypass the Senate and build a new city, and so, there's all kinds of theories and stuff. But the fire burnt those sections of the city that had nice places, nice homes, nice things. And so if that's where the fire burnt, that must mean the people in the poor places did it. Make sense? And who would live in like the really poor places? Christians. So what he would do, you could, Sean, go ahead and read H.I.
Tacitus describes the torture of Christians. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skin of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt. To sever as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting the show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car.
Now I researched this out. What they would do, they would get a garment and they would get wax. And so the garment was just, it was a garment, but it was like really, really covered with wax. And at night, you get a Christian, you stick him on a pole and add some kind of oil, and he's a lamp, and he'd burn. So the treatment of the Christians, no one denies that Nero didn't persecute the Christians. No one denies that. The only thing that's kind of fuzzy is whether or not he set the fire, or if he was even in Rome when it happened. But when he got to inflicting the pain and punishment on it, he took it to a whole different level. Whole thing about putting a human in the skins of another animal so a dog would think it needs to kill that because it looks like whatever it looks like. And they had the, it's all the stuff that you've read, like they would put Christians in, where you'd normally have like gladiators and stuff. Yeah, you just stick them in there and then let whatever kind of animals you got loose and people would watch them. And it got their mind off the fire. But this fire was enormous, and it did incredible damage to the city. So after this is the beginning of the persecution of the Christians. And they think that what happened is during this persecution, that's where Peter would be killed. Okay? And as tradition has it, he's crucified. In Rome, they actually have a place where Peter got so frustrated that before this persecution, he got so frustrated that he was leaving the city, and supposedly an angel came and told him, "Nah, you got to go back." And they built a shrine to that. Now, with Paul, it's a lot different. For some reason, Luke just ended the story. And we have this guy, Clement, saying he went to Spain because he was supposed to take the word of Jesus to the farthest ends of the world. And at that time, the farthest ends going west was Spain. Okay? So we don't know if he went to Spain on a mission trip and then came back and the persecution's going on, and then he's identified as a Christian, and since he's a Roman citizen, he wouldn't have been, it would be, you don't crucify Romans. Matter of fact, to tie a Roman up was considered an abomination. You don't mess with it. Somebody, I think you asked me at lunch the other day about when, could you buy Roman citizenship? And I went back to the story when Paul is arrested in Jerusalem, when they're trying to get him and all that kind of stuff. He makes this proclamation to the centurion, I'm a Roman citizen, or to the centurion. The centurion says, I know what it's like to buy a Roman citizenship. It was a big deal. And then Paul says he was born a Roman citizen, and that's where everybody backs off. If you're going to do, if I told you about the time that Paul's in jail, if you did something to a Roman citizen and you're wrong, you've got big problems. Okay, so he could play that card during his missions. So all we know is we don't know that he went to Spain, but there is a church leader decades after he dies who says he went to Spain and came back and was executed. And his execution would have been beheaded. That's an honorable way to die. Okay? So that's what we know about Paul. Now, how long have we been doing Paul? 6 weeks. Is it 7 weeks or 6 weeks?
7.
This is week 7. So, what happens after you take a class? Typically, a test. So,
Open book test.
is it where?
Open book. Oh, no. Sure.
Let me hand these out. It's kind of like an open book quiz.
You just want to see if we're paying attention.
I just want to see if you're paying attention.
Really trying to see if anything's still not being here every night against me.
No, not really.
Know your Bible.
Put the answers up there.
I'm not sure.
Steve's exempt.
Here.
Crazy, when are Stan and Diane coming back?
They're back.
He just chose not to. Didn't want to take the test.
Question.
He must have found out about it.
We called Bob shortly before we left the house,
Yeah.
but they got back
Not
to
like you. I don't like studying.
but he didn't say why he wasn't coming, and so Bob didn't ask since he didn't volunteer.
He'll never know what happened to Paul.
Oh, and you'd answer one of those.
He'll go through life without knowing.
Yeah.
He didn't go see it. Oh, he didn't go see
Lydia was the lady that,
Let's go back to your notes.
she's the lady that
Now, you ready?
stole the purple cloth.
I didn't get one.
Who didn't get one? I'm sorry.
I'm not even studying.
Anybody else?
I don't remember anything about Phoebe.
Anybody else? Okay, so here's the question. And these are in no order. It's not like they follow the order that we did the class. We talked about patrons. Remember? Now, do we remember who Lydia was?
Dealer in purple.
Right. And if you go If you go to Israel, and I think it was in Caesarea, they tell you how they created the color purple. Seemed to me that it came from snails or some kind of sea creature, and it's very, very labor intensive and very, very expensive to make purple, the color, the dye. Lydia was on the cutting edge where they discovered there was a root that could produce a dye, purple. And purple is the color of like royalty. It's a real big deal to have purple. So what did Lydia, remember she had her own business. She was there, right? So tell me about Lydia. What do we know about Lydia?
She was rich.
She was rich.
She supported Paul.
She supported Paul and the people with him. What else?
She opened her house to him.
Gave him a place to stay. And apparently all of her household followed suit, and they were all baptized, right? So that's Lydia. So when we gave the talk about, remember we talked about if the whole thing about being a patron in those days, remember what it meant?
Do a favor, and then you kind of owe somebody. And
The patron is the person in power. And you are a baker. And then this guy here, Richard, sells you the grain. Richard raises his price that's going to make your life miserable. You go to your patron and say, can you help me with Richard? His patron and her get together for a dinner, and in the discussion of dinner and so forth, they, oh, do you know Bob the baker? Yeah. You know Richard, the whatever guy with the grain, right? And so they talk and they work out a deal, and you're okay and you're okay, but in return you owe your loyalty to her, okay? And you would owe your loyalty to your patron. And so when they went around and collecting money for the church in Jerusalem, kind of saying there's a little bit of a patron thing going on there. We're giving you because you need, while we back off a little bit. Okay? All right. I want my excellent reader, Sean, to read Romans 16, 1 and 2.
Okay. I commend you to your sister Phoebe, who is a servant of the church, which is at Corinthia, that you receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints, and that you help her in whatever matter she may have need of you. For she herself has also been a helper of many, and of myself as well.
Now, okay. If you go to the original translation, Phoebe is a deacon. Phoebe is a patron. That's what it really meant. Deacon, patron. Now, go to 1 Timothy, Sean, go to 1 Timothy 3:11.
Okay. Women must likewise be dignified, not malicious gossips, but temperate, faithful in all things.
Some people think that that means women should be nice and so on and so forth, right? Other people think those are the same kind of directions that were given to male deacons. So some people think that when he was talking about the women, he was talking about female deacons.
no, I think he meant for women to be nice.
Okay, well, Bob thinks it's the other, so I'm wrong. Then we talked about, remember we had a conversation about Paul when he's in Corinth, and Paul, anywhere he went, where there was a large Greek, Roman, pagan population, right? And there were many problems that he came up against, right? One of the problems was, here's another one for Stan. Say you lived in Corinth, okay? And you're Jewish. chances are you didn't eat any meat. Any meat. And the reason is that when you would go to make a sacrifice at whatever temple, you'd do whatever you're doing, and then they'd actually cook it and eat it. Okay? If we're a family and we're going to the temple and whatever we got, we sacrifice whatever is entailed in the sacrifice, cutting the throat, whatever it is. And then when we're done, we'd butcher it and cook it and eat it. And if there's leftover meat, that could be sold, that you don't eat, and it's butchered, that would be sold in the public. If you were a Jew, you'd probably just eat vegetables, because you can't eat that meat. Ask Stan if he knows that one. That's pretty deep. So those are some of the things that Paul had to contend with. But the other thing I brought up was the fact about the morality of say, a Roman marriage. What did we learn? In the Roman marriage, you would probably take a wife who just got out of puberty. Let's say she's 13. Then she would be, remember, there's a whole dowry thing that goes with it, right? So the dad is giving money to the son-in-law. And if he divorces her, he's got to give all the money back. But if he catches her in adultery, he only has to give half the money back. But the woman is supposed to be pure, virtuous, and a great woman would produce sons. Right? What did we say about the husbands?
They did whatever they pleased.
A husband, the only rules on not being, loyal to the wife was when you fool around, keep it to like slaves and prostitutes and
Children.
boys or girls, and in any of those relationships, you've got to be the dominant person in the relationship. And if you keep some kept women, they can't be married. You can't fool around with a married woman. That's basically it. So when Paul is going through all this stuff and he's writing the Corinthians, this is the kind of stuff that he was up against. Don't do that. I told you the story that he writes them, and he says they were celebrating the Lord's Supper. Well, the rich people would just bring the meal and the wine and be drinking and having a great old time, and then the poor people are sitting there waiting for the Lord's Supper to start. Literally. And so he has to write a letter to the church, to the members of the church, saying, it's the Lord's Supper. So if you want to do whatever you're doing, do it at home. Don't you have a house to eat and drink your stuff? When you come here, everybody does our Lord's Supper. That's it, So these are the, there's so many, people, I don't think they understand that when you try to convert people, who, let's call them, quote, civilized people, and they've been living in their lifestyle, and it's been going on for hundreds of years, or 1,000 years, whatever it is, and you come in and say, this is a new religion, there's new rules.
This is
the way we do it. And he's going, we got to do it differently. So those are some of the things he was up against. That was Roman marriage. The other thing, what was the big fight between, say, Paul and Peter, or Paul and some of the yokels in Jerusalem?
They wanted to maintain the Jewish traditions.
So what does that mean?
Well, the law.
the laws and circumcision.
So one of his biggest problems was Paul gets converted. Paul goes to Damascus, goes to Saudi Arabia, or goes to Arabia, and then when he comes back, like we said originally, he's a man on fire, and he's too much on fire, and they send him home. But it was revealed to him that, well, I'll put it this way. When Paul would go to a city, he would get out the Torah, and he would say in a synagogue, he'd say, this is the Torah, this is prophecy, let's talk about it. And then he'd work his way all the way through the prophecy and bring it up to Jesus and say, Jesus is the fulfillment of prophecy. This is the Messiah that we waited for. The Jews would say, you're crazy, man. No way in the world. And, okay, why is it no way in the world? Because, if it's in the book of Deuteronomy, wherever it is, a man who is hung on a tree is cursed. So if this Messiah of yours was hung on a tree, God cursed him. That would be their response to him. So when he would first go and speak to the Jews, it was like, here's all your philosophy. I'll tell you some stuff that's just crazy. In doing this class, there have been a lot of different sources, but one of the sources that I've gotten into is listening to Jewish rabbis. I'm talking to guys with beards. Talk about the philosophy and the thought behind their religion. Okay? So I'm listening to a rabbi, and he's telling stories. And by the way he tells his stories and he relates them to everyday people is extremely well. But the way he explains it is, if you know your Torah, your soul is actually, that tiny thing before you have the body, is actually a piece of God. It comes down here, and it's in a human, a body, right? You live life, whatever, and now the body expires. The soul goes back from whence it came, right? But it's got all this taint of earth on it. So they say that in the Torah, it describes what the soul has to go through in the first 7 days. He said, in the Torah, it says the first day's the worst, second's a little better, third's a little better. By the time you get to the fourth and so on, it gets better and better. The soul becomes acclimated and doesn't have the taint of earth. So apparently they do a bunch of praying in the first 7 days because the soul needs it. Okay? And then you continue praying for the soul for 11 months. Because by month 12, he's back. He's fits in.
Was that then or is that now?
I'm telling you that's now, and I'll tell you a story. I'm with Steve, I'm with David, the guys who went to Jerusalem, right? So now we're flying home, right? And you see all these Hasidic Jews, they have these hats and beards. So there's a kid, not a kid, but not a very old young man. And he's in front of me, and we're going through security and stuff, and I just started chatting with him. And anyway, one thing leads to another, and I go, well, what do you do? What do you do for a living? He goes, I study the Torah. I go, yeah, I got that, but what do you do? He goes, that's all I do. And as it turns out, the family in New York supports him and his wife and children, so he studies, that's what he does. Studies the Torah. My point is that when you have generation after generation after generation and generation and thousands and thousands and thousands of years, they've worked this thing to death. And I'm telling you, if they've written commentaries that they interpret the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, it says it describes what a soul goes through, I'll bet you they can show it to you. Or they interpret it that way.
But don't you remember Tal was very resentful of them? Our guy, he was very resentful of those fellas.
He was.
No, maybe that's because of the military service.
No, it's because they get paid for doing, says doing nothing.
Well, you
Yeah,
know,
we had a big discussion about that over there.
well, Paul would have been one of them. He would have been one of them, because that's what he did. And his most formative years were, say, 13 on up, was in Jerusalem, learning that stuff. So, anyway, where we started out on this point was that Paul came to the conclusion that you are saved through grace, you're not saved through works. And that was revolutionary at the time. We also talked in this class about the way first century Jews thought about things. And again, we go back, and what you think about what happens to you when you die is not what they were thinking. If you take a Pharisee, the Pharisee's thinking that, okay, we got to be real strict, get everybody to be real strict, and then the Messiah's going to come, God's going to come, and this God the Jewish God's going to rule the earth, right? And the Messiah's a man, he dies. Well, so they would have believed, ask a Jewish rabbi today, is there life after death? Seriously. And apparently there's 5 different schools of study on that. 1 or 2 of them say yeah. And the other ones, I don't know what they say.
So why do they have a religion?
I'm just saying it would be very interesting to ask a rabbi, because apparently there are different schools of thought about life after religion, or after death. But what the point I was trying to make, if you're a first century Jew, you're not thinking about, that's Jesus, I'm going to turn my life over to Jesus, I'm going to die and go to heaven. That's not what you were thinking. You were thinking, if you were a Pharisee or that school of thought, that you would die, okay? And let's just forget about the soul. That when God and the Messiah comes back, there will be a resurrection of the body and soul. And that's your payoff. Because you're going to live in a perfect place. Heaven's going to come to earth. They're going to come like this. There's going to be a new earth, new heaven. That's it. Forever. Okay? So the biggest thing for me in doing the study of Paul was to think like they think. And there's a really good book, if anybody's interested, that tells you how to interpret the way things are written. Take this as an example. The story of the man who had the great harvest, right? And he had the great harvest. It's so big, he goes, I need to build new barns, and then, as time goes on, man, I'm set, right? And then what happens?
He does.
He's told that this night your soul will be, demanded, right? If you're today, tell me what that man's sin was. What did he do that's so wrong that he should die?
Not relying on God, relying on
If it was God's will.
No.
Not necessarily.
In the first century, his sin was this, that he had an abundance of food, which he could have given to people who had nothing. And there's no reason to believe he wouldn't have crops like this going on, but he was greedy. That was his sin. See what I mean? I mean, the way we interpret it and the way they would have interpreted it are 2 different things. Like when I told you about the prodigal son. I mean, the way we interpret that story and the way they interpret that story are 2 different things. Okay? So all I'm trying to say with all of that is when you study these things, you have to remember, and I said this a couple times, we're 21st century people trying to interpret things that were written in the first century. And the biggest problem you have is that in the Old Testament, everything's written in Hebrew, maybe some Aramaic. In the New Testament, everything's written in Greek. The Greeks have, 7 words for the 7 different words for the word love? 7. It's hard to translate these things to get what they were thinking. Okay, it's very difficult. The other thing we talked about was shaming. I told you that when Jesus stood up to the Pharisees, he says, "You're nothing but a..." I don't know if Stephen said it too. It might have been Stephen called him a whitewashed wall, which was the same thing that Jesus said. You're a whitewashed tomb. And you're just full of old dead man's bones and all kinds of decay. Well, I told you that when Nicodemus came to Jesus, he came at night, he went up to him personally, and he asked the question, right? If you wanted to tell a Pharisee you're a little off in your thinking, you would have gone up to him and said, "Listen, okay, yeah, I get that. But look at it this way. But if you go up to them in public, say at the temple, and you start saying that stuff, you have shamed them." When Paul confronts Peter and says, "You're telling me you won't eat at a table with Gentiles? You've been living like a Gentile. You're only doing that because these guys showed up from Jerusalem." Said it to his face in front of people. That's shaming. Okay? So shaming is a real important thing. Honor and shaming were very important things back then. I talked about Peter. I gave Peter a bad rap. I did. Let's remember some positive things about Peter. Not really. Jesus said some great things about Peter. And Peter said some great things too. When Jesus asked, "Who do men say who I am?" what did Peter say? "You're the Son of the living God." And he said, that was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, rather that was revealed to you by my Father in heaven. So, I mean, Peter said some great things. He just had some issues about living, and he was Jewish, and that's the way he was raised, so he had some issues about living under the law, and that the Christianity should just be, you live under the law and you just believe in Jesus. So I'm going to let Peter off. We talked about the Pharisees, okay? And I've already mentioned it. The Pharisees thought if we had a real strict society and everybody obeyed the rules, when the Messiah comes, God comes, life's good. We won, right? The Sadducees, now this is a pretty unique group. The Sadducees only are in Jerusalem, okay? And they're all aristocrats. And the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection, any resurrection. So the Sadducees are kind of like, I'm involved in this because this is the position I should have, and there's a lot of attention that comes to me, and it gives me a ranking in society, and I can do good things with the Romans, and they can do good things with me, right? That's a Sadducee. Then we talked about the Essenes. Somebody was telling me just the Essenes, and the Essenes are the people that lived at Qumran, Dead Sea Scrolls, and they had taken a prophecy. They had taken a story out of the Old Testament and changed it up and made it a prophecy, and that's how they justified being out in the wilderness, because they messed with this story out of the Old Testament and said, well, we're living in the ends of time, and we are the children of light, and we will have to fight the children of darkness. So that you had them. Then I told you had scribes. Scribe is someone that if you had a little village and you had a dispute, you would come to me, you would come to me, whatever your beef with each other, I'd look up in the law and I'd give you a decision. Scribe. We talked about their vision of the Messiah was a king, and that he would come back and restore their nation and exile all of the pagans, and Israel wouldn't be ruled by pagans anymore, and you'd have God. And we've already talked about God, and we've talked about the temple. The big thing about the temple, just remember, is that Solomon built the first temple, and God would come to that temple, but he left, and he never came to the second temple. Now, I got one handout, and I'm done. This is just a summary of everything we've talked about, and it gives you dates and so on and so forth. So, Steve, I think I'm done, and I'm done on time.